Welcome everyone to the 19th Amendment, celebrating the 100th anniversary of women's right to vote. Thank you all for joining us. We're so glad you're here. Be sure to check out the danburylibrary.org for a full calendar of events and all the other events we have going on. Also, just a quick reminder, September is also Library Card Sign Up Month, and we are doing a Beanstack Challenge. Some of you may remember that from the summertime. The challenge is basically just register your card, new or current library card holders, and do a few fun activities, and then you can enter to win an iPad. So it's pretty fun and pretty easy, I think, too. And of course, thank you to the Friends of the Danbury Library for making this program possible. And I just want to introduce our speaker today, Jordan May. Jordan is a teaching fellow at Fordham University Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. She graduated from the University of California, Davis with a bachelor's in English Language and Literature and History, which she graduated with high honors. She received her master's in American History from Fordham University, where she's currently a PhD candidate. Her research focuses on the visual culture of the women's suffrage movement in America. So without further ado, I will let Jordan take it away from here.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Christina, and thank you so much for inviting me to give this talk. I'm always extremely excited to talk about women's suffrage whenever I get the chance. So this is a great day for me. My presentation is entitled Envisioning Suffrage, the Visual Culture of the California and New York State Campaigns. And this is based off of some of my dissertation research. In San Francisco, during the 1911 suffrage campaign, the California Equal Suffrage League created a float to show why working women needed the vote. A team of black horses wearing yellow livery pulled the float down Market Street, and large suffrage banners floated from each corner. The float included two tableaux. On one platform, two allegorical female figures stood, representing California asking justice for the ballot. On the lower level, real working women engaged in the representative tasks. Shop clerks, a typist, sewing and cannery workers, a nurse, and a professional woman in cap and gown joined a mother surrounded by young children. The float bore the slogan, "These women need the ballot," while children held a sign that read, "Give our mother a vote." In 1915, in New York, Mrs. Havemeyer carried the torch of liberty from Montauk Point to Lake Erie, stopping along the way to deliver suffrage speeches. The torch had been met with such awe and enthusiasm everywhere it went that New Jersey asked to borrow it for its own suffrage campaign. The suffragists decided to pass it on in the most dramatic of fashions, with boats moored in strategic positions halfway between the east and west shores of the Hudson. Mrs. Louisine Havemeyer handed the suffrage torch to Mrs. Mina Van Winkle, mid-river between the New York City and Jersey City. And that's the picture you can see right now, is this very dramatic passing of the torch. These are only two examples of the many publicity stunts the suffrage campaigns in California and New York put on to garner public attention and popular support for their cause. My research examines the visual culture and methods of these two state campaigns. California won the right to vote in 1911, and its methods relied on spectacle, drama, and cross-class appeal, using parades, pageants, and street speeches, which then influenced the New York movement starting in 1912 with the creation of the Empire State Campaign Committee, spurring that state to success in 1917. Many of California's new ideas also influenced the National American Women's Suffrage Association, also known as NASA, to make some changes. Starting with Wyoming, between 1869 and 1917, only states in the West granted women full suffrage. In 1913, Illinois passed a bill that allowed women to vote for president in local offices, but not state representatives. And this became the first state east of the Mississippi to give women such rights. Historians over the last couple of decades have attempted to figure out why states in the West won suffrage first over the more established and progressive Eastern states. There have been many explanations, from the fact that it was easier to pass suffrage through territorial legislators to the fact that there were less women in these states and it would be a safe place to experiment with women's suffrage, to the idea that the harsh living of the frontier made society more egalitarian in some way. Anyway, though, this line of the historiography, what historians have talked about, really views the West as some kind of anomaly that needs to be understood. These historians ask, why, instead of seeing the West as important in its own right. My research instead will show the influence and power the West had on the East. By the early 20th century, the West was no longer an uncivilized frontier society, but a power that needed to be recognized. Although my research does focus on the West and the East, I want to point out that the South was an important region throughout this movement. In the South, racial tensions affected the movement. The suffrage movement was not as strong in the South, as many people feared Black women voting. The suffragists in the South supported the states' rights aspect of suffrage over a constitutional amendment. They wanted to make sure that white women could vote, but not Black women. And this racism extended to the national level, as Black women's suffrage clubs were excluded from affiliating with NASA. The NASA did not want to alienate the Southern Democrats, whose support they needed for an amendment in Congress, by officially recognizing these Black women. Suffragists and some historians have viewed the period between 1896 and 1910 as the doldrums of the suffrage movement. In this time, no new states had won suffrage, and there was no real tangible improvement. Utah and Idaho had given women the right to vote in 1896, and the next state to win suffrage was Washington in 1910. Despite the various state campaigns across the country, every state continued to deny women the vote. Historians, though, have since made the argument that this period was more of a renaissance. Suffragists had created stronger organizations, gained more supporters, adopted modern advertising techniques, and experimented with non-traditional modes of publicity. It is at this time, too, that a new generation of suffragists took leadership roles. Carrie Chapman Catt, as you can see on the left, is known as the greatest organizer of the suffrage movement, and she became the president of NASA from 1900 to 1904. Reverend Dr. Anna Howard Shaw, on the right, took over from 1904 to 1915, and she made important changes to the organization, namely instituting salaries for roles in the NASA. Before, it was all volunteer-based, no one got paid. And she moved the NASA towards a broader-based professional political organization. After a defeat in New York in 1894 and a defeat in California in 1896, both states, instead of being disheartened, immediately got back to work in creating new organizations and reaching new demographies, such as the working class immigrant populations in the cities. There are simply too many organizations to name in both New York and California, all working towards suffrage in this period. Some of the most prominent ones, though, were the Women's Suffrage Party, the Women's Political Union, and the Political Equality Association in New York, and the California Equal Suffrage Association, the California Equal Suffrage League, and the Votes for Women Club in San Francisco. Historians have also reflected on the various tensions and rivalries throughout the suffrage movement. In 1869, the American Equal Rights Association split into the National Women's Suffrage Association, headed by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. This association was much more radical and focused on more general rights for women. It also split into the American Women's Suffrage Association, which was led by Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell, and they focused only on women's suffrage. The Equal Rights Association split over the 15th Amendment and Black men's voting rights. Stanton and Anthony had wanted women's suffrage and Black male suffrage to be inextricable, while the others understood that women's suffrage would have to come later. Black men's voting rights came first. These two organizations eventually merged in 1890 into the National American Women's Suffrage Association in 1890, when the second generation was able to mend some fences. The NASA was the largest official suffrage organization with affiliates and auxiliaries in almost every single state. By the end of the movement, it had more than 2 million members. Another split occurred in 1916 when Alice Paul and Lucy Burns left the NASA to create the National Women's Party over tactics to win the vote. Paul had been part of the militant British suffrage movement earlier in the century, where she had been imprisoned and force-fed. She wanted the American movement to take on more militant strategies like the British movement. But leaders like Carrie Chapman Catt disapproved and believed it would hold the movement back. Paul, with the National Women's Party, picketed outside the White House, which is what this photo shows. They claimed President Woodrow Wilson was a hypocrite. And one of the signs says, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" And "Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage?" These women were arrested, imprisoned, and force-fed for picketing as well. The NASA and National Women's Party worked in different ways for the same goal, but unlike before, there was no mending of fences here. A less tangible rivalry was between the West and the East, which my research will highlight. The suffrage movement officially began in New York with the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. This convention did not come out of nowhere. Women's work in the abolitionist movement led some women to compare their positions in society to those of enslaved people, realizing that both white and Black women faced barriers to full personhood. This realization pushed many abolitionist women to fight for women's rights. It also gave them practical political experience that they brought to the suffrage movement. At the Seneca Falls Convention, Stanton had called for a variety of rights for women, including property rights, right to divorce, dismantling of the system of coverture, and the right to vote, which quickly became the most controversial. When women activists soon fixated on the vote, believing with the vote, they could then solve all the other problems in their lives. Several more conventions occurred in the following weeks. Furthermore, all the main national organizations that developed over the decades were centered in the East, namely New York, Boston, and Washington, D.C. Whenever a state had a suffrage campaign, NASA would send Eastern organizers, as well as pamphlets and other Votes for Women merchandise, to help with the campaign. But some Western leaders resented these Eastern organizers. They took the view of, why should we listen to you when no Eastern states have won suffrage? Why do you think you know better than us? Help from NASA actually alienated local suffragists. Western suffragists considered themselves more progressive and more effective than these Easterners. Easterners still viewed the West as some untamed frontier society and had a really hard time giving up that view. Carrie Chapman Catt helped with this rivalry a little. She grew up in Iowa and had been active in the movement there, so she was able to understand the West more than the other suffrage leaders. Political cartoons, which are my absolute favorite, really represent this tension between the West and the East. In this cartoon, a woman representing New York sits hunched on a low stool in the corner of the room wearing a dunce hat that says disenfranchised. A group of women representing areas that had women's suffrage, namely Canada, Norway, Russia, Australia, England, and the Western states, stand behind the New York woman, obviously laughing and smirking at her. In another cartoon from the Courier, two women labeled as Western women and Eastern women talk over a fence in their backyards. A man representing Western gentleman stands proudly with his fists on his hips in the background and proclaims, "There's nothing too good for that gal of mine. She's as smart as they make 'em." Meanwhile, a man labeled Eastern gentleman sits in a rocking chair on the porch reading a blank newspaper while the Eastern woman claims, "Won't it be mortifying if he refuses to let me vote? It will look as though he considered his own daughter less intelligent than his neighbor's daughter." This comes off as a jab against Western women. How could Eastern men possibly think that Western women are smarter than us? Another cartoon shows three schoolgirls, one on the left labeled Missouri, the one in the middle Illinois, and the one on the right Ohio, all separated by a fence labeled as state lines. The Missouri and Ohio girls are rubbing tears from their eyes and are wearing dirty and ragged clothes. The Illinois girl, in contrast, is clean and wearing nice clothes, obviously taunting the other two girls representing states that had not yet enfranchised women. These cartoons are rather interesting because they have more of a taunting or a mocking tone rather than an encouraging one, which is what you would assume. It gives off the idea that the East should be somehow ashamed of not having women's suffrage because of its position and prestige in the country. Visual propaganda such as this very quickly became an important tactic to gain support for suffrage, and leaders and organizations in New York and California strategically employed this visual propaganda. Harriet Stanton Blatch, the daughter of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Carrie Chapman Catt in New York understood the ability and power of mass advertising to educate and sway public opinion. In letters to her district leaders in 1915, Catt told them to let the posters and advertising convert the public while you sleep, and claimed, "It would seem that a campaign so splendid could not fail." Blatch also claimed in her memoir that the Women's Political Union worked without ceasing to introduce new methods of propaganda, even changing their colors from the traditional suffrage yellow to purple, white, and green, to show the public that there was to be a change in suffrage method. Promoting parades as an important publicity event, Blatch claimed she was convinced that mankind is moved to action by emotion, not by argument and reason. Alice Park, the publicity secretary in California, constantly advised the NASA to change things. She wanted them to change the type they used in letters and pamphlets, and to use a suffrage map on their letterhead. This was advice they shunned at first, and then took once seeing the success in California. She also collected suffrage buttons and badges from everywhere, and she proudly displayed them wherever she went. The visual culture of the suffrage campaign in New York and California played a significant role in creating popular interest and gathering support. Residents of these states could not escape the sheer amounts of propaganda the suffragists produced and placed literally everywhere in sight. Throughout the length of their campaign, suffragists used two different kinds of arguments to persuade people of the importance of their cause. Eileen Creditor, a very famous historian in the ideas of the women's suffrage movement, an intellectual history of the last 30 years of the women's suffrage movement, examines the views of the leaders of the NASA who served for at least 2 terms. She studies the 2 different types of arguments suffragists made. The justice argument that dealt with notions of natural rights, and the expediency argument that explained the unique skills and perspectives women could bring to society. The justice argument claimed that women and men were created equal and had the same rights to political liberty. In contrast, the expediency argument sought to show that women voters could bring about reforms in society. The expediency argument is firmly grounded in the various reforms women took on in the progressive era. The suffragists put these arguments into visual context through leaflets, flyers, posters, and political cartoons. As one of the very first histories written about the American suffrage movement, Creditor's ideas have really defined the field for decades. Other historians of suffrage continue to use her ideas about the arguments suffragists used, but have also added to this understanding by showing how they were not exclusive periodization for when each argument was used, but they're used at the same time. I have found that suffragists working towards the California referendum in 1911 and the New York referendum votes in 1915 and 1917 still found the natural right argument to be valid and useful. The expediency arguments developed from the justice arguments by showing what else women could do with the vote. These arguments work together to present exactly why women needed the vote and how they would use it. In one cartoon from 1913, in the Women's Journal, Lou Rogers, a very prolific cartoonist in support of the suffrage movement, presented the hypocrisy in men not recognizing the value of taxation without representation when women claimed it. Rogers depicts a beautiful woman in a simple dark dress, shackled in chains all over her body, labeled on her, and these chains are labeled as taxation without representation. She stands before a podium, looking beggingly at the male figure, who looks back at her with a horrified facial expression, calling her an unwomanly creature. The man cowers above her behind the podium, hands clasping the edge of the podium. He wears a dark suit and tie with a lapel that reads, "Voter." His hair is on end, his eyebrows raised, eyes shocked, mouth open and turned down, completely horrified. Hovering above him and to his left is a female figure of Liberty. Liberty places one arm behind the pleading woman, encouraging her and supporting her, while her other hand holds a torch over the head of the man. Liberty is unproportionate compared to the other figures to represent her importance and stature within the cartoon. She wears a cap with "Spirit of '76" written on it, connecting her to Liberty in the Revolutionary War. One side of the Liberty figure blends into the background, as the lines of her dress are the same lines that encompass the entire scene, which gives her a ghost-like appearance, emphasizing her as a spirit. According to the man in the cartoon, the woman has been reduced to a creature because she uses a man's argument to achieve her goal, which would also place her in the public and political sphere. Liberty's presence fills the cartoon as the woman is upheld by the ideals of 1776, which had given liberty to the men at that time, and she hopes to imbue the man with empathy for women's lack of independence in democracy under an oppressive regime. A text excerpt from below the cartoon states that bright, thoughtful, intelligent, progressive women know history, and that the disfranchised have always been the slaves of the enfranchised. What fair-minded gentleman can blame the women for breathing the spirit of the revolutionary fathers of our republic? It continues to claim, directly or indirectly, our women are taxpayers. In this way, suffragists made a clear connection between no taxation without representation and the Revolutionary War. In another cartoon that shows the justice argument, also by Lou Rogers, she represents the hypocrisy of denying women the vote while declaring America to be some great democracy. Suffragists especially attacked President Woodrow Wilson's proclamation that America would make the world safe for democracy, with his asking Congress to declare war against Germany in 1917. They exposed this hypocrisy by showing that America itself did not have full democracy. In the cartoon, an extremely tall Uncle Sam with his long, pointy white beard and wearing a military uniform, including a large brimmed hat, marches toward Europe in the war. He holds a banner in his left hand that flows out behind him and reads, "The world's safe for democracy." And his other hand holds a rifle with a bayonet over his shoulder. He looks in front of him with a stern expression on his face, while a very small female figure on her knees at his feet, with her arms held to her sides, labeled as the Women of America, yells, "Give us democracy." Why is America fighting a war to give foreign peoples democracy when American women at home do not have it? The woman pleading with a man for democracy is shown as much smaller than and easily stepped on by the marching Uncle Sam. The man looks straight ahead of him, completely ignoring the woman at his feet, making women and their rights inconsequential compared to expanding democracy across the Atlantic. How can America claim to be this bastion of a democracy when it disfranchised countless citizens and refused to give them equal rights? How could America march to war under a flag of democracy? When he came into office in 1913, Wilson viewed women's suffrage indifferently. In the face of other concerns, such as the Mexican Revolution and the beginning of World War I. Suffrage leaders, though, including Carrie Chapman Catt, never backed down from trying to persuade Wilson to their cause. He eventually publicly endorsed women's suffrage in 1918, which helped lead to the passage of the Federal Amendment in 1919. Suffragists began using the expediency argument during the Progressive Era to show what the vote would do for women and what women would do with the vote. In order to explain women's need for the vote, movement propaganda often showed how women's traditional roles in the home would expand into the rest of society. Men occupied the aggressive, competitive, and sexual public world, while the nurturing, pure, asexual, and caring private world belonged to women. But based on women's moral authority that grew from their purity, suffragists believed women should exercise power in society. The vote would not masculinize women, but would rather allow them to expand the boundaries of their social activism. Furthermore, women's maternal nature would be used to help all children in need, such as stopping child labor, regulating food and drink, and cleaning up the city of germs, as well as of corruption and vice. The vote, said suffrage activists, would make women better mothers because they could better take care of their own children. Women with the vote could only help society, not damage it. Suffragists used the imagery of babies and children, especially those in need, to show how the government endangered the lives of children, but that women would help children with the vote. In a pamphlet titled "Better Babies," a toddler stands against a door, trying to keep the door closed against the encroaching germs. She says, "I wish my mother could vote to keep the germs away." With finger in mouth, the toddler looks worriedly at the germs spewing through the cracks of the door as more germs begin to cover the toy she dropped. Within the pamphlet, the author claims that the infant mortality rate is high in the United States, with 50% of babies dying from preventable causes compared to the lowest rate in New Zealand, where women had the right to vote. The main cause, that the government does not realize the value of babies and does not do enough to educate mothers on how to protect their children. The pamphlet links a low infant mortality rate to countries and states in the US that have women's suffrage. Part of protecting babies was feeding them healthy and wholesome food. Harriet Park, the daughter of Alice Park, drew the following card for the 1911 suffrage campaign in California. The card was quickly reproduced by NASA and could be found across the country, even as a poster during World War I. The card asks for votes for mothers because politics even governs the purity of the milk supply. It is not outside the home, but inside the baby. The card pictures a baby girl suckling a big bottle of milk, eyes looking out to the viewer, and really makes the viewer worried that the milk will actually harm the child. With women in politics, the purity of the milk supply and the quality of food would no longer be a question, because they would understand the importance of it for their own children. According to suffragists, the current form of government did not protect or prioritize the lives of children. Besieged by germs, bad milk and food, and forced into hard labor, children could not have a normal, healthy life. With images of vulnerable children, suffrage activists linked their claims about women's commitment to care for children to larger progressive reforms that required women's votes to come to fruition. With the vote, suffragists asserted that women could not only better protect their children from harm, but they could help to clean the city of corrupt politicians. Prevalent in 20th century cities, but especially New York City, with the political machine of Tammany Hall. The suffragists stated in a pamphlet that Greece and Rome were destroyed by its vices, idleness, intemperance, and dissipation, and so would America fall into ruins if the redeeming influence of women's vote was not brought into politics and society. This personally is probably the best cartoon I have found in the archives. I find it hilarious. The suffragists represented this idea visually in a cartoon from 1912 in Puck, which showed dirty politics as a man in a wash tub who must use the woman's suffrage soap to clean himself. The cartoon claims that he won't be happy when he gets it. The cartoon also states that a woman was acting governor of New Jersey for 12 hours before President Woodrow Wilson became governor in 1911, showing that women do have the capability for politics. This image represents the visual shorthand the suffrage movement created for the possibility that women would clean up politics. Simple symbols, visual metaphors, and slightly witty jokes all did the cultural work that suffragists intended, and condensed complex arguments and ideas into easily accessible, memorable, and digestible forms for a wide and various audience. The idea that women would help clean up the city is further represented by another cartoon from California. In this cartoon, a man labeled as the man who votes stands in the middle of the municipal kitchen in complete disarray. The city treasury cabinet is broken and infested with rats, and the council legislation stove is spilling over with food, among other issues around the kitchen. The woman who wants the vote stands in the doorway, trying to offer help, but the man stops her with his outstretched hand, claiming man alone has the capacity for these great affairs. It is less of a direct jab at political corruption than the previous cartoon, but represents the same idea. Suffragists also often used a map of the United States to show that women's suffrage was spreading across the country, and that full national suffrage for women was inevitable. This too had been an idea from Alice Park in California and used there first, and then influenced NASA to use it as well. She advised NASA to use the map imagery in their letterhead. Despite the annoyance and cost of having to redesign and reprint letterhead when a new state won suffrage, NASA implemented this. The 1911 California campaign used a map depicting states with suffrage in black, forms of suffrage in patterns, and states without suffrage, including California, in white. This map offered a clear message to California voters, clarified in the text beneath the map: California women have no votes. It was designed for a California audience, not a national audience, driving home the message that California was not on the map. California was the first state to use the tactics of public spectacle and of propaganda, reaching large numbers of audience with brief messages such as these. The map offers a visual form of the suffrage movement that the vote emancipates women. White associated with purity, virtue, freedom. while the lack of full emancipation keeps women shackled and in the dark. Black as uncleanness, unclarity. A NASA pamphlet written about 1915 entitled "Votes for Women is a Success, the Map Proves It," also showed a map with states shaded. Besides the map, the states with full suffrage are listed with the years they won it. Beneath the map, these same states are listed with the number of votes in the Electoral College each has, with a total of 91. The West has been enlightened with suffrage and democracy, while the East is still in darkness, but the enlightening force of suffrage will soon spread across the nation. After the 1913 disaster of the suffrage referendum in Michigan, where suffrage lost by 96,000 votes, Catt claimed, "We have a clear demonstration there of the powers of light against the powers of darkness. The darks won, but in the long run, I say the sun will drive them out." And the sun did drive them out. In May 1919, the House passed the 19th Amendment, and in June, the Senate passed it, sending it to the states for ratification. The movement for ratification was just as grueling as the state campaigns throughout the decades. The NASA and the National Women's Party immediately mobilized their members in all states to convince the state legislators to pass the amendment. The fate of the amendment ultimately came down to Tennessee, and even more narrowly, to one man named Harry Byrne. Byrne was 24 and the youngest member of the Tennessee state legislature. He was listed as undecided on the subject of women's suffrage, but he did promise the suffrage leaders that he would vote to ratify it if it came down to his vote. During the last vote to ratify the amendment on August 18th, 1920, he had a letter in his pocket from his mother, telling him to be a good boy and to vote for ratification. He voted yes, making the total vote 49 to 47. Tennessee became the 36th and last state needed to ratify the 19th Amendment, ending the 72-year-long fight. The amendment says, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex," technically giving all women the right to vote. In reality, the amendment really only gave white women the right to vote. For the majority of Black women, state constitutional loopholes continued to deprive them of the right to vote. This would only be rectified with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Native Americans gained citizenship in 1924, but they also faced state barriers to voting until 1957. Latinas also were barred from voting by poll taxes and literacy tests. Many minority groups still continue to face voting barriers even today, with the closure of polling places in dense areas and other state requirements that explicitly bar certain people from voting. With the centennial of women's suffrage this year, just passed on August 18th, we should celebrate the amount of effort and courage these women exerted. Without those thousands of women who marched in the streets, lobbied legislators, spoke on soapboxes on street corners, picketed the White House, handed out pamphlets, and a variety of other actions when these were considered unwomanly, women in America would not be where they are today. Women in America have had to fight every step of the way for their rights. And the suffragists started that fight and made it to the first major milestone. It is our responsibility today to not only remember these courageous women, but to continue their work towards equality. And I wanted to end on a picture of a new statue in Central Park. It represents Sojourner Truth, Susan B. Anthony, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton as the women's rights pioneers. It is the first statue in Central Park to depict real women. And it's very fitting that this opened on the centennial of women's suffrage. Thank you very much.